The old pickup truck rumbled to a stop in front of the gleaming glass towers of the Royal Crown Hotel. Steam rose from under the hood, and the engine made a tired clicking sound as it finally went quiet. Anyone watching might have thought the driver had taken a wrong turn somewhere. David stepped out of the truck, his work boots hitting the polished concrete of the parking area. His jeans were dusty from the construction site, and his flannel shirt had seen better days. A small tear near the pocket told the story of catching it on a piece of rebar earlier that morning. He stretched his back, feeling every one of his 42 years after the long drive from the job site 3 states away. The hotel in front of him stood like a monument to luxury. David had been working since 5 in the morning, supervising the renovation of a historic building that was being converted into a boutique hotel. His company specialized in these types of projects, taking old structures and breathing new life into them. He loved the work, but it meant getting his hands dirty and being on site to make sure every detail was perfect. As he walked toward the hotel entrance, David noticed the valet attendants. 2 young men in crisp uniforms stood near the golden doors, their eyes following his movement. One whispered something to the other, and they both looked puzzled. This was clearly not the type of guest they usually saw arriving at the Royal Crown. The hotel had a reputation that stretched far beyond the city limits. Movie stars stayed here when they were in town. Business executives made million-dollar deals in the restaurant. Politicians held private meetings in the conference rooms. The cheapest room cost more per night than most people made in a week. David understood their confusion. He looked like someone who belonged at a roadside motel, not a 5-star establishment. But looks could be deceiving, and David had learned long ago not to judge people by their appearance. He wished more people shared that philosophy. The automatic door slid open with a soft whisper, and David stepped into another world. The lobby was enormous, with ceilings that seemed to stretch up forever. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting warm light over everything below. The floor was made of marble so polished that it reflected the chandeliers above, creating the illusion of walking on light itself. Expensive artwork lined the walls, and fresh flowers filled the air with a sweet scent. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, and well-dressed guests moved through the space with quiet confidence. Everyone seemed to belong except for the man in work clothes who had just walked through the door. David took it all in with quiet satisfaction. He remembered when this lobby was just a sketch on paper, when he had spent hours with the architects and designers discussing every detail. The marble had come from Italy, specially selected for its unique veining. The chandeliers were custom-made by a company in Austria that had been crafting crystal for over 200 years. He walked across the lobby, his boots making soft sounds on the marble. A few guests glanced his way, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. He noticed a woman in pearls whisper something to her companion, who looked over at David and frowned. The reception desk stretched along one wall like a piece of art itself. Made from a single piece of black granite, it curved gracefully and was polished to a mirror finish. Behind it, the staff moved with practiced efficiency, checking in guests and answering questions with professional smiles. David approached the desk, already knowing what was likely to happen. He had experienced this before at other hotels, restaurants, and businesses. People made assumptions based on how someone looked, and those assumptions were often wrong. The woman behind the desk was in her 30s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that looked professionally applied. Her name tag read Ashley, and her smile seemed genuine until she really looked at David. Then something shifted in her expression, and the smile became more cautious. "Good afternoon," David said politely. "I need to get to the penthouse suite." Ashley blinked, clearly not expecting that request. She looked David up and down again, taking in his appearance with growing concern. The penthouse suite was reserved for the hotel's most important guests. It cost $5,000 a night and came with its own butler service. "I'm sorry, sir," Ashley said carefully, "but are you sure you have the right hotel? The penthouse suite is, well, it's quite expensive," David nodded. "I understand. I just need access to it for a few hours." Ashley's expression became more worried. She glanced around, probably looking for security or a manager. This was clearly outside her normal experience. People who could afford the penthouse suite didn't usually show up looking like they had just finished building a barn. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and a credit card," Ashley said, her voice becoming more formal. "The penthouse suite requires a significant deposit, and we need to verify that you can cover the charges." David reached for his wallet. Understanding her position but also feeling a familiar frustration, he had been judged by his appearance countless times, and it never got easier. Some people seemed to think that clothes defined a person's worth, that someone in work boots couldn't possibly have money or deserve respect. As he pulled out his wallet, David noticed that other staff members were starting to pay attention to the conversation. A security guard had positioned himself nearby, trying to look casual but clearly watching the situation. The assistant manager had emerged from a back office and was whispering with another employee while glancing in David's direction. The wallet was old and worn, made of leather that had been softened by years of use. David opened it and pulled out his driver's license and a credit card. Both were in perfect order, but he knew that wouldn't necessarily change anything. People who had made up their minds about someone often found reasons to stick with their first impression. Ashley took the documents with obvious reluctance, as if she was humoring someone who was clearly confused about where they were. She swiped the credit card through her machine and waited for the results, her fingers drumming nervously on the granite counter. The machine beeped, and Ashley looked at the screen with surprise. The credit card had not only been approved, but it showed a credit limit that made her eyes widen. She looked at the license again, then at David, then back at the screen. "This is unusual," she said slowly. "The system is showing some interesting information about your account." David waited patiently, knowing that the computer system was probably displaying more than just his credit information. The hotel's reservation system was connected to a database that tracked guest preferences, spending history, and other details. If Ashley was looking carefully, she might notice some things that didn't match her assumptions about the man standing in front of her. But prejudice was a powerful thing, and David had learned that people often found ways to explain away information that didn't fit their preconceived notions. He stood quietly, wondering if this would be one of those times when someone chose to see the truth, or if he would have to deal with another uncomfortable situation. The lobby continued to buzz with activity around them, but David felt like he was in a bubble of tension that was about to burst. What happened next would depend on whether the people around him could look beyond his appearance and see the person underneath. Unfortunately, David's experience told him that wasn't very likely to happen. Ashley stared at the computer screen, her confusion growing by the second. The credit card information showed numbers that didn't make sense with the man standing in front of her. According to the system, this was either a very wealthy person or there had been some kind of mistake. She looked up at David again, taking in his dusty clothes and worn boots, then back at the screen. "Sir, I'm going to need to speak with my manager about this," Ashley said, her voice tight with uncertainty. "There seems to be some kind of issue with the system." David nodded calmly. "That's fine. Take your time." But Ashley was already reaching for the phone, her movements quick and nervous. She dialed an extension and turned slightly away from David, speaking in a low voice that was still loud enough for him to hear. "Mr. Peterson, I have a situation at the front desk. There's a gentleman here who says he needs access to the penthouse suite, but..." She paused, glancing back at David. "Well, he doesn't exactly look like our usual clientele. The credit card went through, but something seems off." David felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over the interaction. He had hoped that maybe this time would be different, that the staff would simply process his request and let him go about his business. But people's assumptions were powerful things, and they often overrode logic and evidence. Within minutes, a man in an expensive suit appeared from a hallway behind the reception desk. Richard Peterson was the front desk manager, a thin man in his 40s who took pride in maintaining the hotel's exclusive atmosphere. His eyes found David immediately, and his expression shifted from professional curiosity to barely concealed alarm. "Good afternoon," Peterson said, approaching the counter with the confident stride of someone used to handling problems. "I understand there's been some confusion about room availability." "No confusion," David replied evenly. "I just need access to the penthouse suite." Peterson looked David up and down with the practiced eye of someone who made quick judgments about people for a living. The assessment clearly didn't go in David's favor. His smile became more strained, and he clasped his hands behind his back in a gesture that suggested he was preparing for an unpleasant conversation. "Sir, I appreciate your interest in our accommodations, but the penthouse suite is quite exclusive. Perhaps I could interest you in one of our standard rooms. We have some lovely options that might be more suitable. The word suitable hung in the air like a small insult. David felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his voice level. I specifically need the penthouse suite. Is it available or not? Peterson glanced at Ashley, who was still looking between David and her computer screen with obvious distress. She gave a small nod that seemed to confirm the room was available, which only made Peterson's frown deepen. The penthouse suite costs $5,000 per night, Peterson said, his tone suggesting that this information should end the conversation. Plus taxes and fees, and there's a security deposit of $10,000 that we require up front. That's fine, David said simply. Peterson blinked, clearly not expecting that response. He had been sure that mentioning the price would send this inappropriately dressed man on his way. Instead, David was reaching into his wallet again, pulling out another credit card. This should cover everything, David said, placing the card on the granite counter. Peterson picked up the card with obvious reluctance, as if it might be contaminated with something unpleasant. It was a black card, the kind that banks only issued to their wealthiest customers. He had seen them before, but never in the hands of someone who looked like they had just finished a shift at a construction site. Sir, I'm going to need to verify this card more thoroughly, Peterson said, his voice becoming more formal. These types of transactions require additional security measures. David nodded. Do whatever you need to do. But instead of processing the card, Peterson was signaling to someone across the lobby. David turned to see a security guard walking toward them, his hand resting casually on his radio. The guard was a large man with short gray hair and the kind of presence that suggested military or police experience. Is there a problem here? The guard asked, his voice calm but alert. Officer Williams, this gentleman is requesting access to our penthouse suite, Peterson explained, emphasizing the word gentleman in a way that suggested he had doubts about its accuracy. I wanted you to be aware of the situation in case we need assistance. Officer Williams looked David over with professional interest. Unlike Peterson, he didn't seem immediately hostile, but there was definitely caution in his expression. Sir, do you have business here at the hotel? I'm trying to conduct business, David replied, but I seem to be having some difficulty getting basic customer service. The comment made Peterson's face flush slightly. He clearly didn't appreciate having his professionalism questioned, especially by someone he viewed as unsuitable for his establishment. Sir, we pride ourselves on providing excellent customer service to our guests, Peterson said, his voice rising slightly. But we also have policies and procedures that we must follow to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone staying here. What policies require you to treat customers differently based on how they're dressed? David asked. The question caught Peterson off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Around them, other guests were starting to notice the conversation. A couple in designer clothes had stopped their conversation to listen, and a businessman with an expensive briefcase was pretending to check his phone while clearly eavesdropping. Ashley was still standing behind the counter, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She kept glancing at her computer screen, then at David, then at Peterson. Something about the situation was bothering her, but she didn't seem to know how to voice her concerns. Look, Peterson said, lowering his voice and trying to regain control of the situation. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Perhaps if you could provide some additional identification or maybe a reference from someone who can vouch for you. A reference? David repeated. I need a reference to rent a hotel room? Well, not exactly a reference, but Peterson was starting to look flustered. Given the unusual nature of this request and the significant amount of money involved, we just want to make sure everything is legitimate. David understood what was really happening. Peterson had decided that someone dressed like a construction worker couldn't possibly afford the penthouse suite, and now he was scrambling to find reasons to justify his prejudice. The credit cards were real, the money was there, but the assumptions were too strong to overcome with simple facts. What makes this request unusual? David asked. Other than your assumptions about me? Peterson's face grew redder. Sir, I'm not making assumptions. I'm following standard hotel procedures. Do you ask all your guests for references? We ask for additional verification when circumstances warrant it. And what circumstances warrant it in this case? Peterson was trapped and he knew it. He couldn't say what he was really thinking without exposing himself to accusations of discrimination. But he also couldn't back down without losing face in front of his staff and the watching guests. Officer Williams stepped forward, sensing the rising tension. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil. Mr. Peterson, what exactly do you need to verify this gentleman's reservation?" "He doesn't have a reservation," Peterson said quickly, seizing on what he thought was a valid point. "He just walked in and demanded access to our most expensive suite." "I didn't demand anything," David corrected. "I asked if the suite was available and said I wanted to rent it." "But you don't have a reservation," Peterson repeated. "Do I need a reservation?" "Is the suite booked?" Ashley cleared her throat nervously. "Actually, Mr. Peterson, the penthouse is available tonight. And we do accept walk-in guests if they can meet our requirements." Peterson shot her a look that could have melted steel. Ashley seemed to shrink behind the counter, clearly regretting speaking up. But her comment had exposed another hole in Peterson's position, and David wasn't about to let it pass. "So the suite is available. I can meet your financial requirements and you accept walk-in guests," David summarized. "What exactly is the problem?" Peterson was running out of reasonable-sounding objections. The truth was that he simply couldn't believe that someone who looked like David belonged in his hotel. But saying that out loud would create problems he wasn't prepared to handle. "The problem," Peterson said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "is that I have a responsibility to all of our guests to maintain certain standards. This is an exclusive establishment, and we can't just let anyone walk in off the street." The words hung in the air like an accusation. David felt the familiar sting of discrimination, but he also felt something else, a quiet anger that was starting to build into something more substantial. He had been patient, he had been polite, and he had followed all of their procedures. But it was becoming clear that no amount of cooperation was going to overcome their prejudices. Around them, the lobby had grown quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Some guests were openly staring now, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. A few had pulled out their phones, though whether they were calling someone or preparing to record was unclear. David looked at Peterson, then at Officer Williams, then at Ashley behind the counter. 3 people who had made assumptions about him based on nothing more than his appearance, and who were now doubling down on those assumptions despite all evidence to the contrary. "Anyone," David repeated quietly. "Is that what I am to you? Just anyone off the street?" Peterson's face went pale as he realized what he had just said. The words "anyone off the street" echoed in the marble lobby, and several guests turned to stare openly at the unfolding scene. He had crossed a line, and everyone within hearing distance knew it. "That's not what I meant," Peterson said quickly, but the damage was already done. His voice carried a note of panic as he tried to backtrack. "I simply meant that we have procedures we must follow." David stood perfectly still, letting the weight of the moment settle over everyone present. He had heard these kinds of comments before, but rarely so blatantly stated in front of witnesses. The businessman with the briefcase had lowered his phone and was watching with obvious interest. The couple in designer clothes had moved closer, no longer pretending they weren't listening. "What procedures require you to treat paying customers like criminals?" David asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Officer Williams stepped between them, sensing that the situation was about to get much worse. "Let's all take a step back here," he said, his hands raised in a peacekeeping gesture. "Mr. Peterson, maybe we should just process the gentleman's request and move on." But Peterson was too deep in his position to retreat now. His pride was on the line, and backing down would make him look foolish in front of his staff and the watching guests. Instead of de-escalating, he doubled down on his stance. "Officer Williams, I appreciate your suggestion, but I'm responsible for the security and reputation of this establishment," Peterson said, his voice growing more authoritative. "I cannot in good conscience allow someone to access our premium accommodations without proper verification of their identity and intentions." "You have my credit cards and my identification," David pointed out. "What other verification do you need?" "Anyone can get fake identification these days," Peterson replied, immediately realizing he had made another mistake. The implication that David's documents might be forged was even worse than his previous comments. Ashley gasped audibly from behind the counter. She had been running David's credit cards through multiple verification systems while the argument continued, and everything was coming back legitimate. More than legitimate, actually. The spending history and credit limits suggested someone with significant wealth, not someone trying to run a scam. Mr. Peterson, Ashley said nervously, maybe you should look at what the system is showing about this gentleman's account. Peterson waved her off dismissively. I don't need to look at anything else. My judgment is based on years of experience in hospitality management. The comment revealed everything about Peterson's thought process. He wasn't making decisions based on facts or evidence. He was making them based on prejudice and assumptions, then looking for ways to justify those decisions after the fact. David felt his patience finally beginning to fray. He had tried to handle this situation with dignity and grace, but Peterson seemed determined to escalate the confrontation. Around them, more people were gathering. Hotel staff members were appearing from various corners of the lobby, drawn by the commotion. Guests were pulling out phones to record what was obviously becoming a significant incident. Your experience tells you to judge people by their clothes? David asked. My experience tells me to be cautious when situations don't seem right, Peterson shot back. What exactly doesn't seem right about a customer wanting to rent a room? Peterson was trapped again, and his frustration was beginning to show in his body language. His face was flushed. His hands were clenched at his sides and his voice was getting louder. Everything about this situation is unusual. You don't look like someone who belongs in a 5-star hotel. You're asking for our most expensive suite without a reservation. And you're being deliberately difficult about our verification procedures. I'm being difficult. David's voice remained level, but there was steel in it now. I've answered every question, provided every document you've requested, and been nothing but polite while you've insulted me repeatedly. I haven't insulted anyone, Peterson protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You've questioned my identity, my financial status, my right to be here, and my intentions, David listed calmly. You've implied that I'm running a scam, that my documents might be fake, and that I don't belong in your establishment. If those aren't insults, what would you call them? Officer Williams was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He could see that Peterson was making mistakes, but he also understood the delicate position hotel staff were in when dealing with potentially problematic guests. However, David's behavior had been completely appropriate throughout the interaction, which made Peterson's attitude harder to defend. Sir, Officer Williams said to David, I understand your frustration, but maybe we could find a compromise here. Perhaps if you could provide a business reference or contact information for someone who can vouch for you. David turned to face the security officer directly. Officer Williams, let me ask you something. If I were a white man in an expensive suit having this same conversation, would you be asking for references? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Officer Williams opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Around them, the lobby had grown quieter as people strained to hear the exchange. The racial undertone of the situation was now out in the open, and everyone present understood the implications. Peterson's face went from red to white in seconds. He had been careful not to say anything explicitly discriminatory, but the pattern of his behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. This has nothing to do with race, he said quickly. This is purely about hotel policies and procedures. Then explain your policies, David said. Show me where it says that customers must meet your personal approval based on their appearance before they can rent rooms. Peterson stammered, unable to produce any written policy that would support his actions. The truth was that the hotel's actual policies were designed to be inclusive and welcoming to all guests who could meet the financial requirements. What Peterson was doing was based entirely on his own prejudices. Ashley had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. She finally found the courage to speak up again, her voice shaking slightly. Mr. Peterson, I think you should see what the computer is showing about this gentleman's account. There's information here that might change your perspective. I don't need to see anything. Peterson snapped, his composure completely gone now. I've made my decision based on the information available to me. What information? David asked. My appearance? My clothes? The color of my skin? That's enough, Peterson said loudly, his voice echoing off the marble walls. I'm asking you to leave this establishment immediately, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing. The threat sent a ripple of shock through the gathered crowd. Several people gasped, and phones that had been discreetly recording were now being held up openly. Someone in the crowd muttered, "This is crazy," and another voice said, He's not doing anything wrong. David stood his ground, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the escalating threats. I'm not trespassing. I'm a customer trying to rent a room. You've taken my credit cards, you've seen my identification, and you know I can afford your rates. The only reason you want me to leave is because you don't like how I look. Officer Williams was in an impossible position. His job was to support the hotel staff, but Peterson's behavior was clearly inappropriate and potentially illegal. The situation was being recorded by multiple people, and any action he took would be scrutinized later. He reached for his radio, calling for backup and a supervisor. I need additional units at the Royal Crown Hotel lobby, he said into the radio. We have a situation that needs immediate attention. Peterson looked satisfied with this development, believing that calling for more security would intimidate David into leaving. But David remained unmoved, standing quietly in the center of the growing crowd. He understood that this was a moment that would define not just his own experience, but potentially the experiences of others who might face similar discrimination in the future. The lobby was now filled with dozens of people, all watching the confrontation unfold. Hotel guests, staff members, and even some people from the street who had heard about the incident were gathering to witness what was clearly becoming a significant event. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Ashley was still staring at her computer screen, her face pale with what appeared to be shock. Whatever information she was seeing had clearly shaken her, but Peterson continued to ignore her attempts to get his attention. He was too focused on his confrontation with David to notice that his own employee was trying to tell him something important. "Sir?" Ashley said more loudly, her voice cracking with stress. "Mr. Peterson, you really need to look at this information. Right now." But Peterson was beyond listening to anyone. He had committed himself to a course of action based on his prejudices, and he was determined to see it through regardless of the consequences. He pointed toward the hotel entrance with a dramatic gesture. "I want this man removed from my hotel immediately," he declared to Officer Williams. "He's disturbing our guests and refusing to follow our policies." David looked around at the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle. These people weren't disturbed by his presence. They were disturbed by Peterson's behavior. Some were recording everything on their phones, others were shaking their heads in disgust, and a few were openly expressing their disapproval of how he was being treated. "Your hotel?" David asked quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Is that what you said? Your hotel?" Peterson nodded emphatically, too angry to catch the significance of David's question. "That's right. And I have the authority to remove anyone who doesn't belong here." David smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a happy smile, but rather the expression of someone who had just heard something that would prove to be very important later. Around him, the crowd continued to grow and the sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance. What none of them knew was that in just a few minutes, everything about this situation was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The elevator doors on the far side of the lobby opened with a soft chime, and Catherine Rodriguez stepped out into what looked like chaos. As the general manager of the Royal Crown Hotel, she had been in an important board meeting on the 32nd floor when her assistant had frantically called about an emergency situation in the lobby. Catherine was a woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the hospitality industry over 25 years. She had managed hotels in 5 different countries and had dealt with every kind of crisis imaginable. But as she looked across the crowded lobby, she could see that this situation was unlike anything she had encountered before. Dozens of people had gathered in a circle around the reception desk. Some were hotel guests, others were staff members, and a few appeared to be strangers who had wandered in from the street to see what was happening. Most troubling of all, many people were holding up phones, clearly recording whatever was taking place in the center of the crowd. Catherine moved quickly through the crowd, her practiced eye taking in the details of the scene. She could see Officer Williams speaking into his radio with an expression of deep concern. Peterson was standing near the reception desk, his face red and his posture aggressive. Ashley was behind the counter, looking pale and distressed while staring at her computer screen. And in the center of it all stood a man in work clothes, calm and composed despite being the obvious focus of everyone's attention. Catherine felt a jolt of recognition, followed immediately by a wave of horror as she realized what must be happening. "Excuse me, "Pardon me," Catherine said, pushing through the crowd with increasing urgency. "Let me through, please." As she broke through the inner circle of onlookers, the full scope of the situation became clear. Peterson was in the middle of what appeared to be a heated argument with David Chen, the owner of not just this hotel, but the entire Royal Crown hotel chain. The man who employed over 3,000 people across 12 properties. The man who had personally interviewed Catherine for her position and had trusted her to manage his flagship location. "Mr. Chen," Catherine exclaimed, her voice carrying across the marble lobby. The crowd fell silent instantly. Peterson turned toward Catherine with a look of confusion, clearly not understanding why the general manager would be addressing the man he was trying to have arrested. Officer Williams lowered his radio and took a step back. Ashley looked up from her computer screen with an expression of dawning comprehension. David turned toward Catherine with a slight smile that held no warmth. "Hello, Catherine. Interesting way to welcome guests to the hotel." Catherine's face went white as she realized the full magnitude of what had happened. David Chen was not just any guest. He was the owner of the property, the person who signed her paychecks, and someone she had known personally for over 3 years. More importantly, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the hospitality industry, despite his preference for working hands-on at construction sites and avoiding the spotlight. "Mr. Chen, I am so sorry," Catherine began, but David held up a hand to stop her. "Let's not apologize yet," David said calmly. "First, let's make sure everyone understands what's been happening here." Peterson was staring at Catherine with growing confusion. "Ms. Rodriguez, do you know this man?" Catherine turned to look at Peterson with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Peterson, I'd like you to meet David Chen. He owns this hotel. He owns all of our hotels. He's your boss and my boss and the boss of everyone who works for this company." The words hit Peterson like a physical blow. His face went through several different colors before settling on a grayish pale that suggested he might be about to faint. Around them, the crowd erupted in murmurs of shock and surprise. Phones that had been recording the confrontation were now capturing Peterson's moment of realization. "That's impossible," Peterson whispered, but his voice lacked any conviction. Ashley suddenly found her voice. "Mr. Peterson, this is what I've been trying to tell you. The computer system shows that this gentleman has a platinum corporate account with unlimited spending authority. He's listed as the primary owner in our guest database. I've been trying to get your attention for the last 10 minutes. Peterson turned to stare at Ashley as if she were speaking a foreign language. The information was too overwhelming to process, and his mind seemed to have shut down in self-defense. He looked back at David, then at Catherine, then at the crowd of people who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Officer Williams stepped forward, his professional instincts taking over despite his own surprise. "Sir, I apologize for any misunderstanding. If you'd like to file a complaint about how you've been treated, I can help facilitate that." David looked at the security officer with something approaching respect. Unlike Peterson, Officer Williams was trying to handle the situation professionally despite the awkward circumstances. "I appreciate that, Officer Williams," David said. "But before we talk about complaints, I'd like to understand exactly what happened here." "From the beginning," Catherine nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Chen. We'll conduct a full investigation and provide you with a complete report." "I don't need a report," David said. "I was here for the whole thing. What I'd like is for Mr. Peterson to explain his actions to everyone present." Peterson looked like a man who wanted to disappear into the marble floor. The confident, authoritative hotel manager who had been threatening to have David arrested was gone, replaced by someone who could barely stand upright. His career was clearly over, and everyone in the lobby knew it. I thought," Peterson stammered, unable to form complete sentences. "You thought what?" David asked patiently. "I thought you were trying to scam us," Peterson admitted, his voice barely audible. "Based on what evidence?" Peterson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The truth was that his assumptions had been based entirely on David's appearance, and saying that out loud would only make things worse for him. Catherine stepped in to fill the silence. "Mr. Chen, I take full responsibility for the situation. Mr. Peterson was acting without proper authorization and against company policy. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our organization." David nodded slowly. "And what are the values of our organization, Catherine?" Respect, inclusion, and exceptional service for all guests regardless of their background or appearance, Catherine recited. The company mission statement she had helped write 3 years earlier. Interesting, David said. Mr. Peterson, do those sound like the values you were demonstrating today? Peterson shook his head miserably, unable to speak. The crowd was still recording everything, and David was aware that this moment would likely be shared widely on social media within hours. How he handled this situation would send a message not just to his employees, but to the broader public about what kind of company he ran. Officer Williams, David said, I'd like to ask you something as a neutral observer. In your professional opinion, if I had been a well-dressed white man making the same request, do you think I would have been treated differently? Officer Williams considered the question carefully. He was being asked to comment on a sensitive topic in front of a crowd of witnesses, but David's calm demeanor and reasonable tone made it clear that he was looking for an honest assessment rather than trying to embarrass anyone. Sir, based on what I observed today, I believe your treatment was influenced by factors that had nothing to do with standard hotel policies or security concerns, Officer Williams said diplomatically. David nodded. Thank you for your honesty. Ashley cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Chen, I tried to tell Mr. Peterson about your account information, but he wouldn't listen to me. I should have insisted more strongly. Ashley, you did nothing wrong, David assured her. You followed proper procedures and tried to provide accurate information. The fact that it was ignored isn't your fault. Peterson finally found his voice again, though it was weak and shaky. Mr. Chen, I sincerely apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and I understand if you want to terminate my employment. David looked at Peterson for a long moment, considering his response. The man had clearly acted inappropriately, but David also understood that people could learn from their mistakes if given the opportunity. Mr. Peterson, you're right that you made a terrible mistake. Multiple mistakes, actually. You made assumptions based on appearance, you ignored evidence that contradicted those assumptions, and you escalated a situation that should have been resolved in minutes. Peterson nodded miserably. But, David continued, I'm more interested in what you've learned from this experience than in punishing you for it. The crowd was hanging on every word, clearly surprised by David's measured response. Many had expected him to immediately fire Peterson and possibly pursue legal action. What have you learned? David asked. Peterson took a shaky breath. I learned that I have unconscious biases that affected my judgment. I learned that I need to listen to my staff when they're trying to give me important information. And I learned that treating people with respect should be more important than my assumptions about whether they belong in a particular place. David nodded slowly. Those are important lessons. The question is whether you can apply them going forward. Catherine watched the exchange with growing amazement. David was turning a potentially devastating public relations crisis into a teaching moment, handling the situation with more grace and wisdom than she could have imagined. The crowd around them seemed equally impressed with his response. But David wasn't finished yet. He looked around at the dozens of people who were still recording the conversation, knowing that his next words would be heard by thousands of people beyond those present in the lobby. This situation happened because people made assumptions about me based on my appearance, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. Unfortunately, this kind of discrimination happens every day to people who don't have the power to demand better treatment. Today, everyone gets to see what it looks like when those assumptions are wrong, but the assumptions are always wrong, because a person's worth has nothing to do with how they're dressed or what they look like. The lobby erupted in applause, with people clapping and cheering David's words. Several voices called out, "That's right and well said." The energy in the room had completely shifted from tense confrontation to something approaching celebration. But David held up his hand for quiet, because he had one more thing to say that would determine the future for everyone involved. The applause died down as David raised his hand for silence. The crowd sensed that something important was about to happen, and the lobby fell quiet except for the soft sound of the water fountains and the distant hum of city traffic outside. Before we move forward, David said, his voice carrying to every corner of the marble space, I want everyone here to understand something. What happened today wasn't just about me being embarrassed or inconvenienced. This kind of treatment destroys people's dignity. It reinforces harmful stereotypes, and it creates an environment where some people are made to feel less worthy than others. He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Some people were nodding in agreement, others looked thoughtful, and a few seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I'm fortunate because I have the resources and position to address this situation, David continued. But think about all the people who experience this kind of discrimination without having any way to fight back. They're judged, dismissed, and humiliated, and then they just have to walk away and accept it. That's not the kind of world I want to live in, and it's definitely not the kind of business I want to run. Catherine stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to show leadership in a difficult moment. Mr. Chen is absolutely right. This incident shows that we need to do better as an organization. We need better training, clearer policies, and a stronger commitment to treating every person who walks through our doors with respect and dignity. Peterson, who had been standing in miserable silence, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Chen, I want to do whatever I can to make this right. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to learn from it and help make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. David studied Peterson's face, looking for signs of sincerity versus desperation. What he saw was a man who genuinely seemed to understand the gravity of his mistakes and was looking for a path toward redemption. Mr. Peterson, I appreciate that sentiment, David said. But words are easy. Actions are what matter. If you're serious about making this right, you'll need to prove it through your behavior going forward. I understand, Peterson replied. What would you like me to do? David was quiet for a moment, considering his options. He could fire Peterson immediately, which would send a strong message but wouldn't necessarily change anything for future guests. He could pursue legal action, which might generate publicity but wouldn't address the underlying issues. Or he could try something different, something that might actually create positive change. Here's what's going to happen, David said finally. Mr. Peterson, you're going to take a leave of absence to complete extensive diversity and inclusion training. You're going to spend time volunteering with organizations that work to combat discrimination, and when you come back, you're going to help train other staff members on how to avoid the mistakes you made today. Peterson nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I'll do whatever it takes. But, David continued, his voice becoming more serious, this is your one chance. If anything like this happens again, anywhere in our organization, your employment will be terminated immediately, and I'll be checking on your progress personally. I understand completely, Peterson said, relief evident in his voice. David turned to address Catherine. As for the hotel's policies, I want a complete review of our training programs and customer service procedures. Every employee needs to understand that discrimination of any kind is not just wrong, it's grounds for immediate termination. Absolutely, Catherine agreed. I'll have a comprehensive plan on your desk within a week. Ashley, who had been quietly watching the exchange, raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Chen, could I make a suggestion? David smiled at her, the first genuinely warm expression he had shown since entering the hotel. Of course, Ashley. What do you think? Maybe we could create a system where staff members feel more comfortable speaking up when they see something wrong happening, she said nervously. I tried to tell Mr. Peterson about your account information, but I didn't feel like I could insist when he ignored me. That's an excellent point, David said. Catherine, I want you to work with Ashley on developing protocols that empower all staff members to intervene when they witness inappropriate behavior, regardless of their position in the company hierarchy. Catherine nodded, making mental notes. We'll make that a priority. Officer Williams stepped forward, clearing his throat politely. Mr. Chen, I want to apologize for my role in this situation. I should have recognized that Mr. Peterson's behavior was inappropriate and intervened more effectively. David looked at the security officer with respect. Officer Williams, you were in a difficult position, and I thought you handled it as professionally as possible under the circumstances. But I would appreciate it if you could share your observations with Catherine for her report. Of course, sir. I'll provide a complete written statement. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered to hear the conclusion of the conversation. Several guests approached David to shake his hand and express their admiration for how he had handled the situation. A businessman who had been present for the entire incident said, I've never seen anyone turn a bad situation into something positive like that. You should be proud of how you conducted yourself. A young woman who appeared to be a college student stopped to speak with David as well. Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for what you said about people who can't fight back. I work in retail. and I see customers get treated badly all the time because of how they look or talk. It means a lot to hear someone with authority acknowledge that it's a real problem." David thanked her for her comments and encouraged her to continue speaking up when she witnessed unfair treatment, even in small ways. As the lobby gradually returned to normal, David finally had a moment alone with Catherine. They walked toward the elevator that would take him to the penthouse suite he had originally requested 3 hours earlier. "Catherine, I want you to know that I don't hold you responsible for what happened today," David said. "You weren't here and you responded appropriately when you arrived." "Thank you, Mr. Chen, but I still feel like I failed in my oversight responsibilities," Catherine replied. "This never should have happened in the first place." "You're right about that," David agreed. "But the question now is what we do to prevent it from happening again. Not just here, but at all of our properties." Catherine nodded. "I'd like to propose that we make this a company-wide initiative. We could use this incident as a case study in our training programs, obviously with your permission. People learn better from real examples than from abstract scenarios." "I think that's a good idea," David said. "But I want to be sure we're not just going through the motions. Real change requires more than just new training slides." "What did you have in mind?" David was quiet for a moment as they stepped into the elevator. "I want to establish a fund that supports organizations working to combat discrimination in the hospitality industry. I want to partner with civil rights groups to develop better training programs, and I want to create a system where employees who witness discrimination are rewarded for speaking up, not punished for making waves." Catherine smiled. "Those are ambitious goals, but I think they're exactly what we need." As the elevator climbed toward the penthouse, David reflected on the events of the day. What had started as a simple request for a hotel room had turned into something much larger. The incident would likely be shared on social media and possibly covered by news outlets, which meant it would be seen by thousands or even millions of people. That visibility brought both opportunity and responsibility. David knew that how he had handled the situation would be scrutinized and potentially criticized. Some people would say he was too lenient with Peterson. Others might argue that he was making too big a deal out of a simple misunderstanding. But David believed he had chosen the right path. Firing Peterson might have felt satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't have created the kind of learning opportunity that could benefit others in the future. By turning the incident into a teaching moment and committing to systemic changes, he hoped to create positive impact that would extend far beyond this single hotel. The elevator reached the penthouse level, and the doors opened to reveal the suite David had originally wanted to access. It was a beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but after the events of the day, it felt somewhat anticlimactic. David walked to the windows and looked out at the city below. Somewhere out there, other people were probably experiencing the same kind of discrimination he had faced today. Some of them would have the resources to fight back, but many wouldn't. They would simply have to accept unfair treatment and move on with their lives. That thought reinforced David's commitment to making real changes in his organization and encouraging other businesses to do the same. The incident at the Royal Crown Hotel had been unpleasant and unnecessary, but if it led to better treatment for others in the future, then perhaps some good could come from it. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant. "Saw the video online. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" David smiled, realizing that the incident was already spreading on social media. He typed back, "I'm fine. Let's set up meetings with civil rights organizations next week. We have work to do." As the sun set over the city, David began planning the changes that would ensure no other guest would ever have to experience what he had gone through that day. The discrimination he had faced was wrong, but his response to it would make a difference for countless people in the future. And that, he thought, was the best possible outcome from a very bad situation.